Shirley Banks, 1987, Bristol. She bought a dress, then vanished forever. Every town has a dark side, but some darkness does not announce itself. It does not arrive with sirens, broken glass, or a warning that people nearby can understand in time. Sometimes it appears inside the most ordinary part of the day, after work, during a shopping trip, in the space between one plan and the next. On a Thursday evening in Bristol, England, a young newlywed named Shirley Banks walked through a familiar city with simple plans. She had finished work, she wanted to buy a dress. Later, she was supposed to meet her husband for a drink. Nothing about that routine should have placed her in danger. Nothing about that night should have turned her name into one of Britain's most chilling true crime cases. But Shirley never made it home, and when police began searching for her, they were not only looking for a missing woman, they were slowly moving toward a man whose crimes would force investigators to ask whether Shirley was the victim of one terrible attack or part of something much larger. Shirley Banks was 29 years old in October of 1987. She lived in Bristol and was recently married to Richard Banks. Before marriage, she was Shirley Reynolds, the eldest of three sisters in a family originally from Edinburgh that had moved to the West Country when the children were young. After school, Shirley studied business management at Bristol Polytechnic, then built a steady working life in the textile industry. By 1987, she worked at Alexandra Workwear in Bristol, where she was known as reliable and settled. She drove an orange Mini Clubman and used it for the everyday journey between home, work, and the familiar places that made up her life. To people who knew her, Shirley did not seem like someone who would simply vanish. She had responsibilities, relationships, and routines that made her absence immediately difficult to explain. Her relationship with Richard had begun years earlier. They met in 1980, moved in together, bought a home in Bristol, and married in 1987. Friends and relatives later described the marriage as happy, though like many couples, they had ordinary strains. There was no clear sign that Shirley was planning to leave. There was no farewell, no known preparation for a new life, just a normal morning and then a night that would never resolve itself for the people waiting for her. On Thursday, October 8, 1987, Shirley went to work as usual. Later accounts described the morning as domestic and calm, a cup of tea for Richard, a goodbye, and Shirley heading out for the day. Whether every small detail of that morning can be treated as courtroom-level fact is difficult to confirm, but the larger truth remains clear. Nothing publicly known suggested that Shirley expected danger. After work, she had plans. She was going shopping and intended to meet Richard afterward. At some point that evening, she went to Debenhams. A colleague saw her there shortly before 7:30. They spoke. Shirley showed her a dress she was planning to buy. A few minutes later, the purchase was completed. That small transaction would become one of the final confirmed pieces of Shirley's life: a dress, a colleague, a shop receipt. Then Shirley left, stepping out of the ordinary world everyone thought they understood. She was expected to meet Richard later for a drink, but she never arrived. At first, the delay did not immediately become a crisis. Richard came home and Shirley was not there. He considered the ordinary explanations people reach for when the alternative is too frightening. Perhaps they had missed each other. Perhaps she was with friends. Perhaps she had gone to another bar. He searched local pubs and spoke to people they knew. By late evening, he returned home and waited. Hours passed. Shirley did not walk through the door. During the night, concern grew, but without a clear sign of violence, the situation remained confusing rather than immediately certain. The next morning, Richard contacted Shirley's workplace. What he heard changed the direction of everyone's thinking. Someone at Alexandra Workwear said Shirley had already called in sick. The message was that she had been up through the night with an upset stomach and would not be coming in. For a moment, that call seemed to suggest she was alive after disappearing. It also delayed the full alarm. If Shirley had contacted work herself, perhaps this was not an abduction. Perhaps she had left voluntarily. Perhaps there was a private explanation that Richard did not yet know. But later, that same phone call would become one of the most disturbing details in the case. Prosecutors would argue that Shirley made it while under John Cannan's control. That claim was part of the case theory, not something witnessed directly, but it explained why the call felt so strange in hindsight. If true, Shirley may have still been alive the morning after she vanished, close enough to a telephone to speak, but not free. As the day continued, Shirley still did not return. Richard contacted people who knew her. Hospitals were checked. Friends were asked if they had seen or heard from her. The hope of a simple misunderstanding began to collapse. Eventually, Shirley Banks was reported missing. Police now faced a troubling set of facts. Shirley was gone. Her orange Mini Clubman was gone. She had last been seen after an ordinary shopping trip. Her work had received a call that made it seem she was still alive, yet nobody could find her. And the people closest to her said this behavior was completely out of character. The response became one of the largest searches Avon and Somerset police had handled. More than 150 officers became involved, and the inquiry would later be described as requiring more than 140,000 hours of work. Investigators searched widely. Divers examined Bristol docks and a pond in Lee Woods. Aerial thermal imaging was used. Friends, colleagues, and family members were interviewed. As in many cases involving a missing married woman, Richard was considered early on. Police looked at the marriage and at Shirley's home life, but they found no evidence that Richard was responsible, and he was ruled out. That left investigators with a frightening possibility. Shirley had encountered someone outside her normal circle. Then another event came into focus. The night before Shirley disappeared, another woman had narrowly escaped an attempted kidnapping in Bristol. Her name was Julia Holman. A man had tried to abduct her at gunpoint near a car park in the Cannons Marsh area. The timing was hard to ignore. An attempted abduction one night, followed by Shirley's disappearance the next. At first, this was only a possible connection, but investigators were about to discover a man who seemed to stand between both incidents and something even darker. John David Geiss Cannan was arrested on October 29, 1987, not for Shirley's disappearance, but after an attack in Leamington Spa. A man entered a boutique, threatened two women with a knife, and fled after one of them escaped and screamed for help. Witnesses gave chase, police responded, and nearby they stopped Cannan, who had a bleeding hand. What began as an attempted robbery investigation quickly opened a door into the Shirley Banks case. Officers searched Cannan's black BMW and found troubling items: handcuffs, an imitation firearm, and a tax disc from another vehicle. That vehicle belonged to Shirley Banks. The discovery changed the investigation immediately. Police searched a lockup garage linked to Cannan. Inside, they found Shirley's missing Mini Clubman. It had been repainted from orange to blue and fitted with false number plates. The false registration was SLP386S. Over the years, people have speculated about whether the letters and numbers were meant to reference Susie Lamplugh, the London estate agent who vanished in 1986, a case in which Cannan would later be named as the prime suspect. But that interpretation was never proven. In Shirley's case, what mattered was simpler and far more concrete. Her missing car had been found hidden and altered in a space connected to Cannan. Cannan denied knowing Shirley. He claimed he had bought the car cheaply from a man outside a car auction. Investigators could not verify that story. Then the forensic evidence tightened around him. Police built a set of Shirley's fingerprints from places she was known to have been, including her home, workplace, and parents' house. One of her thumbprints was found on a document inside Cannan's flat. For a man who claimed never to have met her, this was devastating. The evidence suggested Shirley had been in his property. The prosecution would later argue that Cannan abducted her after she left the shop, held her overnight, and had her make the sick call to work the next morning, possibly by promising she would be released. The idea was horrifying because it made the phone call not a sign of safety, but a sign of captivity. Still, for months, Shirley's family did not have the final answer. Cannan was in custody, the evidence was mounting, but Shirley had not been found. Hope becomes complicated in cases like this. Families fear the worst, yet as long as there is no body, a small, painful possibility remains. That possibility ended on Easter Sunday, April 3, 1988. A woman gathering moss in the Quantock Hills in Somerset found a badly decomposed body near a stream close to a place known as Dead Woman's Ditch. The location was remote, wooded, and grimly named. Police confirmed the body was Shirley Banks. The coroner found that she had been beaten about the head. Later accounts described repeated blows with a heavy object, possibly a rock. After nearly 6 months, Shirley's family finally knew where she was, but the answer gave them no comfort. In April of 1989, John Cannan stood trial at Exeter Crown Court. The case against him did not depend on one detail alone. It was a chain: Shirley's car in his garage, the tax disc in his BMW, the false plates, her fingerprint in his flat, the attempted abduction of Julia Holman, and the wider evidence of violent behavior. The trial also included other offenses, including the rape of a woman in Reading and other abductions or attempted abductions. Cannan was convicted and given life sentences. The judge made clear that he should not be allowed freedom outside prison again. For Shirley's family, the conviction answered the central legal question, but it could not undo what had happened. Her mother, Liz Reynolds, later spoke about the support the family received from the community. Her father, George Reynolds, spoke about the strain of public attention and the media presence around the case. Richard had lived through the nightmare of searching for his wife, then learning that the danger had been hidden inside the normal spaces of their city. Yet the name John Cannan did not fade after Shirley's case. Instead, it became attached to other questions that have never been fully resolved in court. He was later publicly named by police as the prime suspect in the disappearance and presumed murder of Susie Lamplugh, who vanished in London in July of 1986 after leaving her estate agency office to meet a client known as Mr. Kipper. Her body has never been found. The Crown Prosecution Service decided there was not enough evidence to charge Cannan, and he denied involvement. He was also suspected in other cases, including the murder of Sandra Court, but he was never convicted for those crimes. That distinction matters. Suspicion is not the same as proof, but the pattern of allegations around Cannan kept public interest alive long after Shirley's murder was solved. John Cannan remained in prison for decades. He died in custody in November of 2024 at the age of 70. With his death, any remaining possibility of a confession died with him. For the families connected to the wider suspected cases, that silence was another wound. In Shirley Banks' case, the known facts are clear. She disappeared on October 8, 1987. Her body was found on April 3, 1988. John Cannan was convicted of her murder in 1989. Those facts form the spine of the case, but around them sit the questions that make the story so unsettling. Why Shirley? Was she selected at random after leaving the shop? Did the attempted kidnapping the night before show that Cannan was actively hunting for a victim? Did the false number plate mean anything, or was it just another calculated attempt to confuse police? And how many other women crossed paths with him without anyone realizing the danger? For a true crime audience, the temptation is to focus on the killer, because killers create the mystery. But Shirley Banks was more than the final victim in a case file. She was a daughter, a sister, a wife, and a colleague. She had studied, worked, built a relationship, bought a home, and was beginning married life. On the night she vanished, she was not doing anything reckless or unusual. She was simply living. That is what makes this case so chilling. It did not begin in an abandoned place or with a risky decision. It began after work inside a city full of people, with a woman buying a dress and planning to meet her husband. By the time anyone understood that something terrible had happened, Shirley was already beyond help. But the evidence she left behind, her car, her fingerprint, and the timeline of her final movements, brought the truth into court. The mystery of Shirley Banks is not whether her killer was found. He was. The deeper unease comes from what her case revealed, that behind one solved murder stood a man suspected of far more, and that even an ordinary evening can become the point where a life is stolen without warning.